So the first thing I want to do is welcome everyone that joined this session at every possible time of the day. So I made an agenda, and that agenda is given as T+. So starting from this moment of the start of the session. We first have a few talks. We made each 15 minutes. We have to see whether that how that works out, and then at the end we have about 25 minutes reserved for a discussion about the future of the group. I will first give a perspective from Europe, so a progress report from Europe. We'll hear Susan about progress in the USA. We'll hear Andrew about Australia. And then, since this is a collaborative effort, we have Chuck Cook here, and he will tell us about the Global Biodata Coalition. That is something where these three continents are already collaborating. And then we'll go into the interactive session. The one continent that has been thinking with us to get this all off the ground, but is not represented in the speaker list, is Africa. But they are definitely on board and are very interested to hear what comes out of this session. So for me, it's 1 o'clock at night. For Cape Town, it would have been 2 o'clock at night. I can imagine that that is too much to do. Let me just get started with my part. I'll represent a little bit the progress in Elixir since the last plenary. The last plenary is actually when I originally planned to have this this session as well, but then I let it slide. So maybe a little bit more than half a year of progress in Elixir. Elixir started at the beginning of 2020 with a new project where every one of the nodes in Elixir, 23 countries and EBI are working together in a focus on data management. And important parts of this project are to bring together national networks of expertise. So every country has a different status in its data management practices, and bringing together these networks makes it possible for all of us to learn from each other. There is a huge training program in this project. There is a very interesting work package where I am myself also active, that is trying to make data management toolkits, so trying to help people via a website to find the right tools in and outside of Elixir to help the data stewards. And then there are a number of use cases brought in by the Elixir communities into this project. So this is a view on the research data management toolkit that is really in build-up phase at the moment, and people from inside and outside Elixir are welcome to contribute to this. We've been organizing some hackathons already to build this up and to fill this up, but it is still largely a work in action. So you see here the wheel of the representing the data life cycle, and each of these is actually a button that will show representative good hints on how to work in those phases. There are also different entries via the role that is now being uploaded by Google. There is a way of specifying the domain. So if you're coming from one of the life science subdomains, different kinds of problems. So if you want to solve a problem for storage, then these kind of things are listed in here. And the tool assemblies are really how to put things together in certain workflows, though that is also often coming from domains. So this is the first thing that is happening in this work package, and we really will hope that this will be useful for many data managers in life science work. Well, of course, this year a lot of the work has focused on COVID-19, and EBI actually has been asked by the European Commission to work on a data portal for COVID-19 data, and this actually has been added to this Elixir Converge project as a new work package, and is being run by EBI in collaboration with a number of the nodes in Europe. So there are also national nodes, and there is work underway in exchanging information between these national and the international data portal. Another very interesting project that is started, the initiative was taken somewhere last year, I think, is somebody just had the brilliant idea of bringing 1 million genomes together in Europe, and originally it was only planned to be whole genome sequencing. I think there's now, in addition, whole exome sequencing to it. And what changed is it changed from an initiative to a project that also supports this initiative. The original initiative was taken by a lot of ministries in different countries. Very interestingly, different ministries in different countries. So in the Netherlands, it happened to be with the health ministry, but I know that in the Czech Republic, it was dealt with by the trade ministry. But all of this has been coming together, and luckily, the infrastructures, BBMRI for the biobanking and Elixir have been involved in the initiative, and now Elixir is leading this project to actually get it off the ground. The Elixir organization then, so we still have our 5 platforms, and more initiatives are coming up for communities that are actually the bridge between the platforms and Elixir's user outside. The ones that I'm giving here at the bottom, food and nutrition and toxicology, are the latest new additions still being added. Microbial biotechnology is also relatively new. So we're really extending the interactions with user communities. And another thing given in orange here is a lot of initiatives that used to be in Elixir in different places have now all been brought under one name as focus groups. So you see there is already a whole list of focus groups. I darkened out 2 that are mostly with an internal focus for the organization, but there are lots of other ones that are have information for people, users, and people outside of Elixir. So the difference between a community and a focus group there is that communities really get support from the Elixir hub, and the focus groups are mostly maintained by interested people in the Elixir organization, and don't necessarily get any support, definitely not financial support from Elixir, just support in maintaining the group. And the last thing that I wanted to mention about the state of Elixir. So we started formally with the first scientific program in 2014. And from 2014 to 2018, we had the first 5-year program. We are now almost halfway the second scientific program. And the third one is being planned to take place from 2024 to 2028. And our CTO up to now, Jerry Lanphier, has stepped back from that position to be able to focus on writing this next program, and together, of course, with all the heads of nodes from the different countries. So there I am going to stop presentation here. Let me see. And I am looking at the chat. I saw that there were some things coming in, but I didn't follow up. So does Elixir track the economic impact of the data management activity? There is an impact group that is actually trying to work with some standard techniques of determining the value of what we are doing. So this is one thing. There is actually, I think, even a part of a master's that is going on, a master's degree where some of the people from Elixir are taking part to learn how to measure this. And there is also a lot of experience with this actually in EBI. So we're actually in a good company there to figure this out. Federated human data, I can also explain. At the moment, it is not clinical data. There is very little experience with clinical data. There is a lot of interest in clinical data, but this is not the traditional experience of Elixir. Federated human data is a growing out of the EGA activity. So it's the European Genome Phenome Archive, which has a lot of genome data. And since a lot of that data is often linked to a location and cannot move, there are initiatives to move the metadata into a central database, but be able to give access to the data from distributed federated systems. So that's what federated human data focuses on at this moment. Ian, you also have questions, so.
Yeah, I got a question about a couple of your slides, but I just add something onto that last point. I mean, it sounds like it would connect with the Federated Analysis Systems project within GA4GH, and Elixir has been heavily involved in that. Alex Knitz and others, so those discussions are ongoing. But it touches upon the thing you just said, and one of our use cases for cancer data has been to combine dbGaP data with EGA data, pancreatic data, and we're using that as a use case. So that's definitely an area to explore. Yeah, the two questions, Rob, back on your, it's good to hear about the Elixir Converge effort. Could you go back to that slide?
Okay, I can really try
to. The cycle one. And I feel, I mean, I can speak to it before it comes up. I thought one of the great things about that, is, so many of our activities don't kick in until you get to that red piece of the circle, share. But I think what you have here is very reflective of, it has clear heritage from Baron Mon's book, right, about stepping through. Sharing is going to be so much easier if you plan what you're doing, that you think about this when you're collecting the data, processing and analyzing it and preserving it, rather than saying, we've done the study, now let's share the data. You've got to think about it early. So great point. Great that you've got that in there. The question is about the orange box and research, because everything you're talking about here, and you've got to focus on data management. And, it kind of goes with the point I'm just making, that is really going to be focusing on the people who are doing the science, who are doing the study. But when you get to that reuse box, what's your level of engagement with the third parties who are going to be using the data as part of this Converge effort?
So in Converge, we are not going to do the engagement. So the level of engagement in the project is that we are a conglomerate of people who are doing the data management or data stewardship for these researchers, and so they get the questions from researchers that are looking for this, and so in Elixir, they can be really helping to set up the data in such a way that it is becoming more and more easy to reuse.
Okay, and I'll pass on my other question and let it go to somebody else.
Okay, good. Then I'll unshare again. And I think, was there more questions or? So from Matthew, how will Elixir be involved in EOSC in the future? Already, so several of the people in Elixir have been taking part in the working groups set up by the European Open Science Cloud. And I'm one of them who have been working in the FAIR working group. My colleague Celia van Gelder has been working in the training working group. A Belgian colleague, Frederick Coppens, is also very active. He is in the architecture working group of the EOSC. So yes, there is a very tight connection with all the work that is being set up for running EOSC.
I know there's been a set of competence centers piloting projects within Elixir and supported by EOSC, but to my knowledge, I'm not sure whether you're going to be involved in EOSC Future, which is the project kicking off next year. Maybe you can correct me.
I don't know about it. No, sorry.
No worries.
Okay. So then the next speaker is Susan.
Thanks. Wow, really good at keeping on time. This is awesome. Thanks. It's a beautiful night here in DC area. Hopefully it's nice where you are. Just a shout out to two of my colleagues from NIH who are also joining me and will certainly participate in answering any questions. Dr. Ian Four, who you know super well from cancer, and Dr. Jenny Larkin from the National Aging Institute. So I am going to share my screen. All right, where did it go? Hang on. Sorry about this. Just take me a minute. Okay. There it is. And I have to switch the display. Okay. Although it's November 11th where you are, Rob, it's still the 10th for us here in DC, so crossing multiple time zones. And I just have to say right off the bat that I forgot to put in a slide for our biggest announcement, which is that we have published our NIH data management and sharing policy, which I or one of my NIH colleagues will link into the chat. It just came out the day before Halloween, I believe October 29th. It's a big advance for NIH, requiring all of our NIH funded investigators, including our intramural researchers, to create a data management plan when they apply for a grant at NIH. That data management plan is substantial. It does require thought in terms of how researchers will manage their data, which data they intend to share, how they will share it, what metadata they will use. So researchers will really have to think about this, and I can already see that the tool that you are providing through the Elixir, and I'm going to maybe shamelessly borrow or collaborate on such a tool, will be very helpful for all of our researchers. And it's really all of our grants and contracts, with the exception of training awards or awards for infrastructure, which don't not necessarily produce scientific research data. I don't need to tell you guys what FAIR is, but sometimes I like to think about when data is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Have we finally reached our goal? Is this the end of the road for us, or perhaps actually it's more just the beginning? And I think this is where we are today. We are at the start of something truly wonderful. It's a race or a journey, which we are all on together, and I think we all contribute to it. We've done a lot at NIH to make data available to researchers. I'm just going to call out one particular activity. There's tons of activities. This one is the Sequence Read Archive. You know, it's all those little snippets of everything that's sequenced, from microbes to chickens, even humans and humans under controlled access data through dbGaP. This data is now, excuse me, mirrored on 2 clouds, on the Google Cloud Platform and on AWS. And so it's about 37 petabytes of both public and controlled access data. It's a huge amount of data. It's made available through our STRIDE, Scientific Technology Research Infrastructure for Discovery, Experimentation and Sustainability program. And that program really does provide discounts to NIH-funded researchers on data storage and compute, providing also additional training activities and educational activities, and some enhancements in the pipeline of workflows. I'll talk about that in a minute. So one of the nice things that we're able to do by making all of this data available is that we've been able to work with a number of researchers to enhance their search across petabyte scale data. It's still a grand challenge, to be sure, but we've been able to sort of narrow down, for example, a cohort of metagenomic data of SRA, do a search across those 2 petabytes of metagenomic sequence data, pull out COVID-related sequences, and then look at the evolution of COVID, both in time and geographic location. So this is just one of the activities that we're super excited about. We have over 80 petabytes total of biomedical data on our 2 cloud providers. It's providing a lot of interesting challenges for data management at a scale of the petabyte range, as well as large scale compute. This is just another example of the TopMed, the Omics Precision Medicine Initiative, that we've put all of TopMed and the Biodata Catalyst, which is itself a federated cloud-based platform, on a number of clouds, including Azure, which is not part of STRIDES. They were able to work with AWS to enhance their pipelines for genomic analysis, and I think they were able to reduce what normally would have been about a 12-month pipeline analysis to a couple of months. So they were really able to significantly increase the workflow that the Biodata Catalyst was able to provide for the TopMed analysis. We have a lot of NIH cloud platforms actually that we support. The NHGRI Genomics Data Sequence Science Analysis Visualization Informatics Lab Space, the Anvil. You're probably fairly well familiar with the All of Us program, Biodata Catalyst, which I just mentioned, and then the NCI Cancer Research Data Commons, which Yan can talk quite a bit about. All of these are running different platforms. Gen3 is probably one of our more familiar platforms, Terra as well, 7 Bridges. What we want to do, actually, is to create a meaningful connection across these data platforms. And of course, why we would want to do that is because there is data across these platforms that researchers are interested in. For example, there's overlapping data between Biodata Catalyst and Kids First and all of us. There's overlapping data, either genetic sequencing data or clinical record data. And so in order to aggregate and provide meaningful analysis across these platforms, we have to do what's probably going to be a considerable amount of work. And I'll show you what we're doing now for COVID to help work on this problem. But this is sort of a bit of a holy grail. It's not easy. I think that multiple platforms on multiple clouds with different controlled access requirements, different consents, different consent processes, different types of data models, different types of data elements. It's a bit of a challenge, to be sure. But what are we doing to take a lot of this data science activity and address COVID? Because what we want to do is to put data into our platform so that researchers can use it, and getting data, COVID data, into a platform in and of itself is turning out to be a bit of a challenge. Why would we want to do that? To better understand the transmission and infectivity of COVID, to understand and evaluate treatments in a hypothetical space, to predict the long-term sequelae of COVID. There are absolutely the case that COVID is a whole body experience, and not everybody experiences COVID in the same way. And the long haulers, as we call them, have different symptoms and different effects. We also want to understand the social determinants of health related to the exposure of COVID. It's also the case that although COVID is an equal opportunity virus, it does not affect all of us in the same way. And examine the impact of child and maternal health. And finally, there's just some really, really interesting technical issues to working with COVID across a very large landscape. This just says, I think what I said a little bit, why is the long-term sequelae so important? Patients have different hospital stays and different outcomes from the hospital stays. These are use cases from our researchers, different risk factors for long-term morbidity. And there are definitely different geographic differences in patient outcomes from COVID. So we've put a lot of data into a number of platforms. I'm just going to give you the rundown. In all of us, there's about 63,000 participants who have taken, who are COVID tested, have taken a COVID public health survey. All of that public health survey data is in all of us. We'll also have serology data. Most of that data is going to be available between the end of November and the first week of January. The Biodata Catalyst is just finished registering their first clinical trial. It's an ORCID trial. ORCID is a study of hydroxyquinine in inpatients with symptomatic COVID. I think we're going to have probably around 6,000 patients for the ORCID trial. We'll have additional clinical study trials. We'll register them and get them into the Biodata Catalyst. The N3C, the National COVID Cohort Collaborative, has approximately 175,000 participant EHR clinical related record data. It's all de-identified, but it is row level data, comprised of sites from most of the CTSAs, those clinical and translational centers, as well as 8 CTSR idea state sites. So that is, I think it's about over 1 billion sort of data sets now. And it spans across the country also, including a number of diverse locations. So it's a very rich data set. It's available, and I think researchers can access it now. Also, our Alzheimer's disease sequencing project has a number of Alzheimer's participants who are also COVID positive. And so there's a significant interest in linking together those COVID patients with some of the other data in these other platforms. And finally, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the Medical Imaging and Data Resource Center. But one thing I can tell you for sure is that there's about an 80% overlap of the folks who are in Biodata Catalyst doing a clinical trial and the folks who are in a CTSA N3C National COVID Cohort Collaborative. So it's absolutely the case that we have participants in one or more of these data platforms who share data in other platforms. So we have an opportunity and a challenge to link this data together. There is a challenge. Most of these data cannot leave the enclave or the platform that they reside in. So we have to do some really interesting technology, and that's what gets me excited actually, is how do we solve this compelling problem? And this is sort of the vision. We're working on it. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we're doing. You see the 3 platforms. There's additional platforms like the National Aging Institute Alzheimer's platform. I'm going to tell you about how we're doing unified research authentication services and how we leverage GA4GH. I'm going to tell you about how we're going to actually link all those participants together across these 3 platforms. And then I'm going to tell you about common data elements, because in order to make this meaningful for researchers, we have to actually speak the same language, at least in some level, or we have to figure out how to map across the different data elements in our different platforms. So we have created across NIH and across all of our COVID projects a core set of common data elements. You probably know this, common data elements. There's a question and an answer pair. I think I'm going to show you what they are. These are the core common data elements for COVID-19. I think they're pretty finalized, but I want to just hedge my bets and say that they're nearly finalized. And you can see that we're looking for common data elements and demographics, clinical events, disease and outcome, as well as others. And so we're sharing these with our awardees so that we can at least try to speak the same language. It's very hard to go backwards in data harmonization, but for COVID, we are doing it. We're also linking researchers so that they can sign in once and get access to all the platforms and the data that they can see. So before we worked on this, this is pretty much what it looked like for researchers if you wanted to go to the All of Us platform and the Biodata Catalyst. It was a dance of many different authentication processes, which is time-consuming and not nice. Researchers did not appreciate that they had to drag logins and data across platforms. So during this past year, we worked on developing a researcher authentication service. Currently, researchers log in there. It is strongly based on the GA4-GH authentication processes. So we issue a passport, which is compliant with the G4H passport authentication infrastructure specifications with just some slight modifications. And researchers can carry their passports with them across our system. We're working now on not just authentication, but data authorization so that your data is given a visa and that carries with your passport so you can quickly get access to the data that you've gone through the process of the Data Access Committee or the DUAS to get access to. And finally, how are we actually linking our patients across our different platforms? It's absolutely the case that John Smith, who might be in Biodata Catalyst, is absolutely going to be in a CTSA. There's about an 80% chance of that. We wouldn't know that. So what we're doing is we're doing something that's pretty standard technology. It's a record, privacy preserving record linking technology where we just encrypt the elements that identifies that person. The token, which is the encryption of that person's ID plus the governance of that that person's data, is then sent to an honest broker, and the honest broker does the patient or the participant linking. They do not have any data; they just have the records so that they can actually do the deduplication. So those are three things that we're doing to just create a somewhat more federated system. We have a very long ways to go. Everything in that blue box up there is not done, and there's a lot of it, including important elements in data discovery, because you don't know what you don't know, and we don't have any real effective way right now. But I know that there's ideas, including picture, including work from GA4-GH and others in terms of federated data discovery. Some of this other stuff is pretty non-controversial. The one element that might be kind of interesting is how do you actually do a meaningful compute of data in a federated system across multiple data platforms, which do not allow the data to actually leave the platform. So there's some interesting technology out there, and I think we'll be exploring it. But for me, that is where we have been this past year. We've done a lot of other things too, but I thought in the interest of time and where Elixir is, these might be what is most interesting to you. Opportunities to collaborate for sure. We've got a long ways to go, but I hope that we'll eventually get there. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing and go ahead and answer any questions.
Super, thank you very much.
Thanks.
It's always very, very difficult if there is no interaction with the audience. So I'm trying to help a little bit. So there were some discussions in the chat. I don't know whether there are real questions in there for you.
I'm looking back here.
But otherwise, people can either raise hands or just be blunt and just speak up, because we're only 13, so that's fine. Any questions for Susan?
Well, this is Jenny. I have a question for Susan, but for you as well. So one of the challenges is clearly the federated compute. This is true not only across the NIH associated resources. I think it's also true within Elixir. And then if you're thinking about cross national, sort of even beyond Elixir and across the NIH resources, what are And there are approaches that have been developed, at least as test cases, but what are the real thoughts of being able to, in a secure yet robust way, do federated analyses, and where are their strengths and where are their weaknesses?
I'm happy to address that, but maybe I'll pass to Elixir first, and we can have a really good, because that is a great question. That would be a great discussion topic. Rob, or even open cloud, European open cloud.
Yeah, so European Open Science Cloud will definitely be addressing some of this, because they're also, the cloud providers are part of this, and they took the original initiative for the European Open Science Cloud, and it became a much more social beast than it originally was set out to be. But there is another initiative, and of course, this is more originating in the Netherlands, and I'm seeing it therefore very close up. It's called the Personal Health Train, and there are some other initiatives in other European countries where the idea is, rather than bringing the data together in one place, send an algorithm along the locations where the data resides. And so there are the idea of the Personal Health Train is to not become the European train system, where train tracks have different widths and the voltage lines or the electricity lines have different voltages, but discuss how to make this using fair technology to make this so that these kind of infrastructures are suitable for different questions being asked of the same data.
I agree. I just saw something not too long ago from Red Hat, who acquired Nubo, I think it's Nubo or Nubo, which is pretty much exactly what you just described. It's a compute train, so the data stays where it is with all of its correct permissions, and it's only linked by a linker into your Google bucket, and then the algorithm actually goes and uses that link at the data source to compute. I think we're still pretty far away. I haven't, the demo that was done was pretty simplistic. I think it's a pretty active research question.
Yeah. So there is an implementation that is called EuroCAT, where in several hospitals they're already running trains for to determine lung cancer treatments. So training on data in multiple hospitals without moving it around. That's where we got the idea, but EuroCAT is not based on fair data, so it is made just only to serve this particular use case. And for any other use case, you would need to negotiate even the contracts about the access to the data again.
Yeah, one of my worries is that if there's sort of data formatting, data harmonization issues, I don't know if what we're talking about with this sort of compute train will actually pick up that issue. And so we're going to accidentally have errors in our analysis when we try to aggregate the results in some meaningful way.
Yeah, definitely. So I've heard people who did this kind of work on different data sets with a distributed learning environment. And these distributed learning environments, the first thing that they pick up is where the data is coming from. So it's actually really hard to make it train on a data set as if it is one data set.
Exactly. Yeah, I think this is still early days, but it's exciting, really exciting.
Yeah.
So I had some computer freeze problems. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
So, you know, you're touching on some complexity of compute when the data is distributed, where you really need to have the whole data set that you're computing on in traditional situations in memory, right, within the same analysis. But and certainly the examples we have don't do that yet, but there are examples of federated analysis, and I'll copy in the link Matthew asked about this duo link. These were consecutive, actually parallel sessions at the GA4GH plenary. The federated analysis was actually showing exactly that, and exactly what we're talking about on relatively simple computes.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
aggregating, searching across multiple sites, and then being able to submit the analysis. You know, and one of the discussions in chat, I mean, Susan, you mentioned the 36.4 petabytes of data. Well, actually, SRA data is shared with EBI, but I know that 36.4 petabytes is not being shared. But maybe what is being shared is the ability to say, this is where the data is. And then the thing that we're eminently able to do is for a European researcher to run the compute in the US local to that data. That's possible now. With the more complex computes, there are challenges we have to deal with. But I think we've got the thin end of a wedge here, and we're already, you know, the thick end of the wedge is the advanced computes you're talking about. But I think we've got to start on the thin end of the wedge with being able to do some federated compute through these GA4GH standards.
And of course, the other aspect which hasn't been mentioned yet is that of the perennial problem of the data access in the federated environment as well, having that AI in place to retain security and to have a federated way of authenticating users.
Yeah, that's exactly why the first thing we did was start with the research authentication service, so that we could share that across all of our platforms, because if you don't have that, it's really difficult.
Yeah, so Elixir has been working on this as well, as you probably know, Matthew. What used to be the Elixir AAI is now growing into life science AAI in Europe. So there's a lot of work going on and we only need to blend the two together, but I don't think that will be a huge effort anymore because we're using the same standards anyway. Okay, I think we have to go to the next continent and give Andrew the time and the screen to tell his story.
Okay, thanks a lot, Rob. A perfect segue into what I'm going to present, actually, all of those conversations. So let me share my screen. So I'm going to rush through really the sort of introductory stuff, which is sort of obvious, which is that Australia is not in Europe or the US, and therefore does provide some interesting use cases. And then try and flesh out a couple of examples of things that we are doing in how we're trying to federate data in Australia by necessity. I'll give this slide when I'm in Europe, of course, just to make it clear that we're not actually talking about Austria. But also to make it clear that, you know, Australia is a long, long way away, 14,000 kilometres from the centre of Europe, about the same from the centre of the US. In some ways, in many ways, the worst case federated data scenario you could, you know, hope for. In a world which is, you know, the research world, which is in many ways still defined by data that pours out of Europe and the US. So one of the challenges we have is that we are distant and we're obviously time zone challenged, although this is a lovely time zone for me, this meeting at the moment, and obviously horrid for folk in Europe. You know, another thing about Australia is that it's actually an extremely large country continent in itself with a fairly small population, around 25 million. So it's very sparse, Australia. So actually communicating between the nodes, if you like, even within the country, requires some effort. You know, it's a 3-hour flight between Melbourne and Perth, for instance, from one side of the continent to the other. Now these things are actually impactful on how we provide data and effectively federate data within Australia and globally. And that's something that's become really clear over the past few years when the amounts of digital data are reaching the 36 petabyte level that that Susan's talking about. What does that mean if you're in a country that is not close to that? Australia's actually pretty research productive. And you know, reasonably wealthy, but I think any country, you know, in Europe or of course the US would be able to make the same claim compared to population. We're actually pretty research productive. So in some sense, we're a lot like the US and Europe, but very distant. And with a completely different governance system, of course. So what that means in terms of federating data is how do we address those challenges? You know, how do we connect and share data? Given that we have a lot of cultural research alignment, but we have a bunch of infrastructure challenges to actually do it in practice. You know, it hasn't escaped our attention that there's lots of money going into this stuff, and most of it's going into it in Europe and the US. So if you were to collectively put down a set of activities from a non-EU US perspective that you're interested in engaging with, this would be the starting set. So it is around Elixir, you know, EBI obviously, EOSC Life is an interesting one that's starting up reasonably recently. And on the left, I think, you know, the list of things that Susan talked about, Cyverse, you know, obviously the Genomic Data Commons, Anvil, programs like that. They are being seeded out of the US and the EU. And as a country which is research culture aligned, we need to participate in those. And for us, the challenge is how do we do that? I actually did an extensive study trip, and Susan, a lot of this introductions were courtesy of Vivian Benazzi, actually, across the US. Catching up with the things that are going on there. And of course, you know, there's the population defines the investment to a great level. Yeah. So a lot of money going into things that Australia can't hope to compete with in terms of implementing new things. But we did actually come out of this study trip with some broad conclusions. And that's that, you know, using the, and these are all obvious to all you guys, and I'm going to rush through them because I want to get to the examples. You know, cloud first or cloud-based compute platforms which aggregate or gravitate, I guess, around data are increasingly pervasive. It's probably true that in the US, much more comfort around the commercial cloud providers than in the EU. And that's actually a difference that affects how we implement the infrastructure that allows us to share data in Australia. Yeah. So I think Susan talked about, you know, 80 petabytes in total across Google and Amazon, and that's fine if you agree that that's something that you're willing to accept, that you buy into those platforms to do your analysis. But of course, if you don't, then that's a challenge. Yeah, because that's where that data is. The idea of data commons, a common data commons, if you like, is really strong. I know that there's been a few sort of attempts at building in some sense, an NIH-wide data commons, and maybe that's fallen back to the institute level data commons. I'm not quite sure where that's sitting at the moment. I think that's probably my perception. But the idea of it is, you know, inarguable, right? So how do we get this stuff together, provide methods around it so that people can analyze across those shared data sets, whether they be at the level of, you know, NIH Institute or above. And above is obviously a very challenging thing. One of the things in small text on one of Susan's slides was access, you know, authentication and authorization. Of course, that's actually the major driver if you're not in the NIH. How do you go about getting involved in, you know, accessing and against data which is under a completely different governance system, and this will be a challenge obviously for Elixir as well. I think Elixir is actually doing an extraordinary job of coordinating data infrastructure across Europe. Completely different approach, right? Bottom up from our perspective, as opposed to top down from the NIH. Yeah, and I think you're doing an amazing job of federating upwards, and that's something that we're very interested in, of course, because we are at that sort of that level where we need to integrate upwards rather than be part of something that's coming top down, because of the nature of global politics and federation. There's a few other bits and pieces in here, but I guess our conclusions really is that for Australia, you know, the solution drivers are that the technology and methods are portable now, much more portable than they used to be. particularly with cloud vendors being everywhere, commercial cloud and non-commercial, open cloud, if we want to call it that, through OpenStack and things like that. So you can actually take a cloud-first approach, which was probably quite challenging 5 years ago. We didn't have an Amazon in Australia. We didn't have an AWS in Australia, so we couldn't use it. So that actually precludes you from all, data sharing or federated data sharing solutions that require data to stay in Australia, but are based on AWS. We're not in that position anymore. There's lots of global investment going on. The money that the Broad Institute is spending on the technology underpinning, terror and things like that is really quite extraordinary. One of the things we just need to accept in Australia is this, that we are mostly a method and data importer. We represent a small amount of the world's population. What that means is we need to find ways to effectively import methods and data, but make ours available according to standards that others are probably developing, but we can have input too. I don't think this is different to anyone here. Most of the data, so that's not true. In the National Institutes of Health, and Susan or others correct me here, the data is owned by the NIH. That's not the case in Australia. We don't have that collective agency that owns the data. So actually all data ownership resides in the research institutes that receive the grants. And I think that's probably a lot closer to Elixir, with the exception of EBI. So our interest is, how do we integrate against global data sets? How do we interpret our own data in this global context? And we've ended up with a set of principles which are essentially the formalization of the things I just said. So I'm just going to skip over them. But it's about partnering internationally. How do we engage in the things that are happening internationally, have input into those? And that's one of the reasons that myself and Frankie are here today. And work out how not just the technology, but the processes and the governance mechanisms that are being developed include countries that are being frank, non-US and non-EU. So an example I wanted to get to, there's two that I want to work through, and one of them is just purely around sharing of technology and methods and reference data. And Galaxy as a technology for highly accessible methods is really sort of blossoming, I think, right now. We have a global Galaxy community and a global Galaxy executive now, which Australia is a part of. We have a Galaxy Australia, which has been really, really successful and has allowed us to sort of integrate across this big continent, if you like. But more importantly, I think this weird figure here shows that what we are sharing with Galaxy at a technology level now are the set of tools and the set of reference data that everybody uses in common across Europe, Galaxy, and Australia. And that's really, really powerful. It's not new research data sharing, but the reference data bank that is shared between Europe and the US and Australia is growing and growing. And the tool set is about at 7,000 tools now. And you can basically go on Galaxy Australia and be guaranteed the same research outcome from the same data as you would if you logged on in Europe or the US. And I think that is a really big leap forward. Plus, it mitigates the burden of management of those resources away from each continent towards a global coalition, if you like. One of the outcomes of that we had earlier this year was a nice paper in PLOS Pathogens, which just demonstrated that in the space of 3 days, we could take a suite of COVID data and distribute it across the 3 continents and analyze it in exactly the same way for exactly the same outcome. So it's not earth-shattering, but it was a really nice piece of work. Yeah, we had the same infrastructure, and therefore we could take the same data and get the same outcome, in a really sort of mission-critical timeline. And this is a really good exemplar, I think, of what Australia's approach, which is that what we want to do is to replicate the infrastructure as far as we can, so that we can share the data as easiest as we can. Yeah. the second and last example I'm going to talk about is really exciting for us and me personally, because I've been involved in it since its inception, and it's around sharing pediatric cancer data and the methods around them. And I think it's a really good exemplar of the things that were discussed in the chat just before. How do you have data in different places and actually do virtual cohort analysis for science outcome? So we have a program in Australia called the Zero Childhood Cancer Program. It's just been funded for 70 million Australian dollars, which is, and the aim of this is to genomically characterise every single childhood cancer in Australia over the next 5 years. About 2.5 years ago, again, Vivian Benazzi put me in contact with Adam Resnick, who's the head of Kids First Data Commons, and said we can probably do something here. It's a nice example. It's just fairly tight. You know, pediatric cancers is a pretty tight domain within biomedicine, and of course, much tighter within life sciences overall. So we've got some data in Australia, which is not enough to be statistically significant because we just don't get enough cases of individual high impact childhood cancers. What we need to do in order to be clinically effective is to interpret them in a global context of data. And one of those global contexts is the Kids First Data Commons in Philadelphia. So the idea, of course, is obvious, right? How do we take those two different data sets, which are quite different sizes, and do virtual cohort analysis across them? And the solution in the first instance is to deploy the analytical framework, which is a 7 Bridges framework, in AWS in Australia. Happily, at the time that we decided to do this, AWS had opened a cloud cloud service in Australia. So we talked to 7 Bridges through Kids First, and 7 Bridges were really interested in this. How can we construct a set of workflows through the 7 Cavatica, it's called, that's the Kids First 7 Bridges instance, a portal, but fire off jobs to Australia on Australian data, which is stored on Australian sovereign, if you like, soil. And it's just aggregate or federated data analysis at the level of method, but it's really, really impactful. And it's really, really important for us to understand that the key to doing federated data analysis is to have agreement on the infrastructure underneath. Now, what is not in this diagram is that the agreements for actually sharing the data were all one-on-one and ugly legal sort of, nightmares. Because there were only 2 parties involved. It was a Zero Childhood Cancer Program and it was Kids First. But even so, it was very complicated, and Zero had to join the data consortium of Kids First and whatnot. And there was no technology to streamline that. So that took 9 months, whereas we could get ahead with actually implementing the 7 Bridges instance, Kids First instance in Australia in a much shorter time frame than that. So the technology really lagged the process and the governance in that case. And where we're aiming for now is, what do we do in Australia in this quite specific use case, I think, in order to understand how do we automate that process? How do we automate being able to expose Australian data from Australian soil through common methodological infrastructures that are compliant with what's happening in the US and the EU, because that is absolutely the way forward for Australia. And in this case, of course, the Global Alliance is doing a marvelous job, in my opinion. We're actually looking to, in practice, we're looking to an NIH-sponsored platform called Gen3, which underpins the Genomic Data Commons. Again, being brutally frank, one of the things that attracts us to this is there's been a lot of money spent. It is really mature, solid technology. We don't have to reinvent it in Australia, and it's aligning with NIH and Global Alliance standards. So this is very exciting. We can actually, in some sense, run up a Gen3 instance in a half a day, put our data on there, and we've got a bunch of the technical sort of challenges around how we share data sorted, although not all of them. And when I say not all of them, of course, the challenges are, even in this really narrow case, there is still no agreement on a data dictionary between the Zero Childhood Cancer Program in Australia and the Kids First Childhood Cancer Program in the US. And that's a really narrow, convergence. It's childhood cancer, but there's still no common data dictionary for representing your genome data, even across that. So that's the real challenge, of course. How do you build those data dictionaries that everyone agrees on, even when it's so narrow? It's quite hard to do. How do you do that more generally? A real challenge. Okay, so we started doing some really nice work there anyway. And for us, this is a sort of the bottom-up approach, which is going to work. We're going to take some actual programs of work, and honestly, if we could find a pediatric data commons partner in Europe, I think this is just such a compelling use case for, the driver is, if you can interpret your particular childhood tumor, in the context of global data in real time, using infrastructure as the vehicle for that is so powerful. Okay, so my conclusion. One critical conclusion that we've made so far, we can't, of course, in Australia, and this relates to, how SRA is shared. We can't mirror SRA. It's just not financially practical, and there's no real driver for it. So for us, the driver to federate data from the get-go is stronger even than I would say than it is in the US and the EU. We won't be able to effectively or practically access and import the global data we need into the future. That's just a truism. So global data sharing is huge. So we need to share global data, though, to continue to be sort of globally competitive. But I think what we've demonstrated and what we know is that there's just this enormous sort of infrastructure mountain you need to climb in order to be able to do data sharing or federated data effectively. And we're really interested in this type of forum, RDA for life sciences. How do we agree on that? And it is all around standards, but it's actually around the technology as well. The research or authentication services that the NIH is implementing now, they're really interesting for us. And how do they intersect with AAI that's coming out of Elixir and will underpin, protected data sharing in Europe? So global data sharing is hugely dependent from a non-European or US perspective on shared compute tool and training infrastructures, and of course on the agreed standards. So that's our interest and that's our experience. And I'll stop there.
Super, thanks, Andrew. Again, a little applause for you. They're very, very interesting. I do know some places where pediatric cancer is being done in the Netherlands. In Heidelberg, there is another one in Germany, and there are good collaborations inside Europe. Maybe we can set up a connection there, bring people into contact with you. Are there any direct questions for Andrew at this point?
Yeah, a couple, Andrew. First one's not. You alluded to this question about the current state of the NIH Commons, and
yep.
Your perception was absolutely right. And I think there's also something which I think is very leveling that comes from that. NIH is much less top down, I think, than you're suggesting.
Yeah, okay.
Which I would say should be an enormous boost, right? Because you're in the same, I think you're in the same boat that we are.
Mm-hmm.
We're achieving federation across NIH institutes through global standards. is the truth of it. I mean, RAS is based on Passport. The stuff we've been doing with federating data across some of the commonses that Susan is referring to is using the exact standards you had on your slide.
And that's just wonderful for us to hear. Yeah.
Yeah. The other question I had as I was going on was to try and understand your connection into some of the Australians who've been participating in GA4GH. And looking at your slides, you either have to have been talking to Australian genomics and Oliver Hoffman,
yes,
or you have evolved through a state of parallel evolution. Exactly.
No, absolutely. It's been,
so
there's not so many of us that we can have multiple parallel paths in Australia. So absolutely, the small group that is sort of forming this stuff in Australia involves, people like Oliver Hoffman and Warren Kaplan and and then John Pearson up at QIMR, people that you would, probably be familiar with. And it is the usual suspects who are involved in the Global Alliance for Genomics in Health, development of standards and technologies underpinning those. So.
And the other thing that emerged out of that for me that you can probably throw some light on, though, it comes, I forget, you have states, right, in Australia,
Yeah.
like the US, where
that's right. Yes.
Melbourne genomics, right, is a separate thing than Australian genomics. And
yeah, so Australia's probably a bit like Germany. This, it is a federation, and maybe a bit like the US as well. It is a federation of states, and sort of health funding is split between national and state level. So the same old sort of, I guess, frustrations that you guys would encounter as well, in that states are competitive against each other and want to build their own thing that is going to be the national solution, and yet there is federal money going into national solutions from the top down too. So, but I think at the end of the day, all of this is going to be gazumped by the global standards that are driving everything. And what we don't have, I should say, that I think that makes a really big difference for Elixir is we don't have the Million Genomes program. We don't have that national sort of binding sort of population sequencing program that would probably define what the solution was. Australian Genomics was sort of that, but didn't have enough money. So it might turn out that they get refunded and that turns into that. But we haven't got that really big sort of, all of us / Million Genomes program, which sort of sets the infrastructure roadmap.
And the other
cancer
project, GA4GH has just kicked off, and I'm co-chairing a cancer focus group within that. And Oliver has been part of that group and is bringing a use case to the table. So I hope we've got a good connection there. And so
no, we have a very good connection with Oliver. Yeah, and in fact, our Gen 3 trials have been informed by Oliver to a great extent. So, yeah.
Yeah, and Oliver Oliver's already asked questions about what's our experience with Gen 3, but we've not be able to open that bandwidth yet, but happy to share any of that.
So I'm very happy that we are seeing all the overlap already. So that was the set out actually of the session. I'm seeing already that we are going to have much less time on the discussion at the end, but I think we are showing so much overlap that we can also do a part of what we set out to do in this meeting afterwards. I think we, as one of the examples of things that are already going on worldwide, I'd like to give the word to Chuck to present the Biodata Coalition, and then at least have a few minutes left to get started on reforming the group into a worldwide infrastructure group for us.
So, on that, one thing that struck me though, Rob, in relation to what I think is the excellent agenda that you put as part of this, two aspects of it. One is everything we've heard here is very familiar to me, certainly, and it's very heavily it's very heavily genomic and healthcare. And you highlight, one point is you highlighted this group as, agriculture is also a big life sciences thing.
Yep.
The other thing that I think you set up as part of framing this discussion is, we have lots of healthcare groups. We have GA4GH, we have others. The value proposition in doing something at RDA is the opportunity to connect life sciences efforts into other research efforts besides life sciences, because there's a lot of things that we should be learning from those.
Fully agree. Ian, this is the war that I'm raging within Elixir, because anything that comes out of GA4GH is taken blindly in as a standard in Elixir, and nothing like that happens between standards that are developed in RDA and Elixir. And that's the kind of connection that I want to see, and that probably for you is the same, and in Australia.
I mean, quite honestly, the DIRS service has got nothing life science specific about it.
No. Yeah, so we need to talk. We need to stop looking only at life sciences and make sure that we are opening it. Please let Chuck take it off. Chuck,
Okay.
you're still muted. I hope you can find the unmute.
Sorry, Rob, I thought we were at the discussion point of.
No.
Right, can you see that and hear me now?
Yeah, yes. Both are okay now.
This is a moderately long presentation. I will skip over a few things in the interest of time, but we'll make the presentation available. Hold on, I'm not advancing. There we go. Right, the Global Biodata Coalition, just to lay the groundwork here, we know that life science data resources are a global infrastructure with lots of different types of shared data. And I'd like to say that following up from what Ian said, that we are inclusive here. It's not just medical data. In fact, it's probably less medical data than all of the other kinds of data at the moment. And the key here is that many of the resources, if you look at the last bullet point, are reliant on a very small number of funding programs to support them. And I'll get to which resources we're talking about in a few slides. So as we've seen already, resources are vital, shared data are vital. How many data resources are there? Well, we don't really know. Probably about 3,000 have been created. How many are still in existence? We don't know. Around 100 new resources are created per year, and we're defining this as things that actually publish something and tell the world that they exist. If you look at the last two bullet points here, public spending to support. Sorry, that's a typo. I'll fix it. Public spending to generate data that goes into data resources is around $500 billion per year. Public spending to support the resources is 500 million a year, and those are really rough estimates. So the funders of data, of research funders, are spending around 0.1% of their spending to support the data that are generated from the research. So this seems like really good value for money. The data resources are very interconnected. These diagrams are from EBI data resources. On the left is the interconnections between resources at EBI. On the right is the interconnections between EBI resources, which are on the right-hand y-axis, and about 500 external data resources on the left-hand axis. And this is an incomplete diagram. It's not possible to map all connections because they're not really reported. You just have to get what you can. But the data resources are vulnerable. There are exponential increases in demand, as all of you know, exponential increases in generation of data, which must be stored. Open access policies are also increasing both demand for using the data and the amount of data generated. New technologies are requiring new kinds of data resources. But the resources need long-term funding, and the funding is not long-term, really. It's not funded as a resource. Many things are funded as research projects, as we all know. There isn't very much international coordination among funders, and there's a risk of retreating behind paywalls, which has already happened in some cases. So this is a recognized problem. Here's a paper published mostly by NIH 5 years ago. And if you look at the blue box there, the main point of this is that the first step is for funding agencies to communicate more effectively about data science problems and to seek collaborative solutions. So the Global Biodata Coalition is the result of that plea for cooperation among funding agencies. So the challenge is that there are inequities in how data resources are funded. That is to say, a small number of funders are supporting a very large number of data resources. They're vulnerable to, for instance, changes in strategies of funders who might decide not to fund data resources that they are currently funding. There's not too much coordination across funders to efficiently support data resources, and the paper concluded that a global coalition was needed. And over the past few years, there have been a series of meetings. Many of the people known to you, you can see in this author list and others, to fund the Global Biodata Coalition. The mission of the GBC is to coordinate support for data resources among international funders, and to ensure sustainability of a core set of biodata resources, to expand to the number of funders who are involved in funding data resources, and to enhance biodata resource-related expertise worldwide. So scope of the GBC. So initially, the GBC is focusing only on biodata resources that are available with unrestricted access. And that specifically excludes medical data, patient data, and even things like the EGA, which require access permissions. And this is entirely for practical reasons. We may get to those kinds of data resources in the future. This is just the sort of governance slide. We have a secretariat, which is virtual. In other words, we do not have a place to, we don't have offices. There are only 2 full-time staff at the moment. The Human Frontier Science Program in Strasbourg is the initial host. And at the moment, what that means that they're managing our money. The GBC is supported by research funders, and indeed is if you think of the GBC as a company, it's owned by the research funders. So we are working on behalf of research funders for the research funders to do things for the research funders. But we do have stakeholders, which I'll get to in a minute. And there, we have some programmatic activities, which I'll outline very quickly. So as I said, the GBC is managed and supported by research funders. They're, if you will, the shareholders. The stakeholders are everybody else, people who produce data, people who use data, the managers and staff of the data resources themselves, and other research funders who are not currently members of the GBC. So we have a number of outreach activities, such as today's talk. And we have the outline of a scientific program, which aims to address these 4 questions. How can the biodata resource infrastructure be managed for the benefit of all? And this is specifically aimed at the funders, to get the funders to talk to each other. What indeed is the biodata infrastructure? I glossed over that previously, but it is not well defined in the sense of how broad it is and which kinds of resources should one include in the infrastructure, at least from the GBC's perspective. And what is the value of the infrastructure? And earlier in one of the chats, one of the chat messages was asked how to evaluate the return on investment, and that's something we'd like to address as well. So the scientific program has two two aspects to it. One is describing infrastructure, which I've just mentioned. What is total global spending on life sciences research? How many data resources are there? And what are funders' strategies for supporting data resources? The actions from that will be then to help the funders to improve the efficiency of their spend and to attract additional funders globally to supporting data resources. And then we will also identify global core data resources, which I'll go over very briefly here. So this is a concept pioneered by Elixir in Europe to identify data resources that are really fundamentally important within the infrastructure. These would be resources used by life scientists, almost all life scientists. And the reason to focus on core data resources is essentially practical. If there are thousands of data resources, the Global Biodata Coalition cannot reasonably look at all of them simultaneously and manage to track their funding and to track who's funding them. It's a little bit much more tractable problem to look at a set of core data resources. And we think of these as being analogous to keystone species in the ecosystem. If you focus on the set of core data resources, you'll also help to protect the entire infrastructure. So there's an established approach to selecting core data resources. Within Elixir, we will be using something similar to this, although it will have to be adapted. And you can look at the details in the papers there. And the summary here is, and this is from Eric Green, the head of NHGRI. The summary here is that before establishing the GBC, there's not very much air traffic control, and the GBC will hopefully bring some more rational and sustainable funding mechanisms for the infrastructure of data resources. So at the moment, we have support from Wellcome, NIH, NSF, and A*STAR in Singapore. This will actually expand starting next year. We've got we've got a letter of understanding, and we'll have another 5 or 6 funders coming in, and we'll begin to grow next year with the additional funding. And we've had a lot of in-kind support from the organizations on the bottom. Office space, web services, all kinds of different, and also a lot of staff time from those organizations. Here's our website, and that's all I have to say right now. I mean, I realize that was a very quick overview, but I see that we are running out of time. And I guess the message is that the GBC's role is to try to encourage and help funders of data resources to keep funding them, and that to make sure that the infrastructure is there so that the people working in the RDA have some data to work with.
Super. Thank you very much, Chuck, for your presentation, giving a very good look on why we have to collaborate. And it's also then very nice that you followed up Ian's message on we shouldn't only be health with the message that you are mostly focusing outside of health at the moment. So that's very good. I had prepared some slides on the history and the future of the group, but we only have 3 minutes left. I think that we've done some of the discussion in between the talks, and I hope that all of you agree that we should just call for another meeting. Let's see how we can do that, or arrange things via email. The idea is to change the group that was originally intended by people in Elixir to be representing life sciences worldwide, but that was at a moment that the RDA wasn't ready for it. So the group was set up as a bridge between Elixir and RDA, but now RDA has discipline-focused groups, and we actually have been asked whether we could consider representing the discipline of life sciences worldwide. So growing. Now, what I heard yesterday is that there is no longer only an interest group, but there is also the possibility of a community of practice. And we have to decide among ourselves whether we and how we want to progress from being the Elixir Bridging Force interest group into a life science representing group that does exactly what we've just discussed in earlier discussions between the talks. Get things together, make sure that the life science data infrastructures in the whole world are looking at RDA, implementing RDA standards, but also the other way around, that we channel the developments that we have been doing in the life sciences, and where we are in some places ahead of the rest of the pack, and make the rest of the Research Data Alliance benefit from our ventures from the past. So any other final remarks? I would like to see some or hear some hands for the initiative to start picking this up and doing that in first instance via email and documents, and then maybe calling a meeting to glue it all together.
Yeah, very happy to be involved.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think commitment first goes, Rob, in confirming what the the objective is of the group, but I think there wasn't time to discuss that today.
Yeah.
Longer term commitment kind of think would depend on what we think the goal is.
Yeah. So yeah, it would be nice if we can have a first meeting of a new group, even if it is not yet formalized in the next plenary. I would love to see also that Africa is then involved. Andrew already gave the impression, the beginning of the story of we are structured in different ways. I think Africa is yet another way of structure with different funding and a different granularity that is very interesting for us to get involved. And having 4 continents would really give us a good coverage of the world. Let's see. Thank you everyone for attending this session and for your contributions, and we'll be in contact.
Thank you, Rob.
Thanks a lot, Rob. Yeah.
Okay, bye-bye.
See you, everyone.
Good night.
Bye.
Good night.
Good night.